The Archaeology of Cranborne Chase, presented by Phil Planel, landscape archaeologist and heritage consultant. In this talk, Phil takes us on an exploration of how the great archaeologists that made their name on and around Cranborne Chase were inspired by the landscape around them, and how we in turn, in a different age, can also be inspired by the landscapes around us.
I'm Phil Planel. The subject of my talk today is the Archaeology of Cranborne Chase, yesterday and today. I apologise for it being a recorded talk, but I didn't really want to end up subject to a kitten filter or something even worse. So there we are. Now for this talk, I want to explore how the great archaeologists that made their name on and around Cranborne Chase, and there were a fair few of them, how they were inspired by the landscape around them. And I want to look at then how we in a different age can also be inspired by this same landscape, but perhaps in a different way. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that each age has its own archaeology, and I want to really examine what sort of archaeology will be perhaps developed on the Chase in the future and contrast that with the past. To make the point, I'll slightly later be looking at one particular type site where we can perhaps see what the difference is between concerns about the landscape then and our appreciation about the landscape today. If you were a budding archaeologist in the 19th century, or even in the case of Sir Richard Colt Hall here in the late 18th century, it did help if you had a private fortune and a big estate. And that's something that both Colt Hall and General Pitt Rivers up at Rushmore, of course Colt Hall was Starhead, they both had this. However, there are plenty of big landowners in Wiltshire who weren't interested in archaeology, in the humps and bumps in the landscape. So clearly something else was required, and perhaps an inquiring mind was something that was necessary, a talent for classification, other qualities as well. In addition to this, Colt Hall found that he had time on his hands in that he was at a loose end. He couldn't carry on with his continental tours. He'd done one. I mean, that was the fashionable thing at the time, but they were interrupted by the Napoleonic Wars. And his relatives, who ran the banking concern, they were quite happy for him not to be involved in that. And so he could turn his hand to other things. This is the Library at Starhead, which you'd think would be a good starting point for Colt Hall in his attempt to understand the landscape around him. In fact, I think this library from memory faces west, whereas, of course, the chalk landscape that Colt Hall became so keen on, so interested in, rises on the east. But if you've been to Starhead, you'll know that actually that landscape is just above Starhead. In fact, the library wasn't a huge amount of use to Colt Hall. Samuel Johnson, who'd been writing a few decades previously, had said, "All that is really known of the ancient state of Britain is contained in a few pages. We can know no more than what the old writers have told us." In other words, anything pre-Roman, you might as well give up, according to Samuel Johnson. So that was a first barrier that Colt Hall had to get through. He had to basically go up into the landscape if he was going to find anything out. It wouldn't be by looking at books in his library. Well, here we are, up on White Sheet Hill, above Starhead, an aerial view, which I suppose Colt Hall could have had if he'd gone up in a balloon. But even on the ground, these features are quite visible. And in the top left quarter, you see a round circular feature, what we would now call a Neolithic causewayed camp. And down at the bottom of that feature, there is a little round thing, which we today know is a Bronze Age barrow from a later period. Now, this was, in fact, the light bulb moment for Colt Hall, because it quickly became evident that the features that he was seeing on White Sheet Hill didn't belong to one particular era. They're obviously man-made, and they were contrasting in morphology and type. And in the case of that we've just looked at, one actually cuts into the other. In other words, the Bronze Age barrow cuts into the Causeway Camp. In other words, one is later than the other. And these are the building blocks that allowed the archaeologists on Cranborne Chase, and let's face it, they were in advance of archaeologists in other parts of the country, with a few exceptions. And one reason for that is the chalk. The chalk, as Phil Harding of Time Team has commented, he started even as a schoolboy being interested in the archaeology of his area. It's a dream to work on chalk, because all you have to do is remove the topsoil and you can see any features that have been cut into the chalk. They could be post holes, they could be all sorts of rubbish pits, they could be all sorts of things, but they will leave a dark stain. So it's a much, much easier place to learn about how to do archaeology than in other soils and with other geological conditions. So that's a number of reasons why Colt Hall was lucky to be where he was, and archaeology was lucky to have him. Such was Colt Hall's passion for the archaeology he was beginning to discover on White Sheet Hill and further afield. Such was his passion that he was able to work with someone called William Cunnington, who was a local trader and merchant, not someone that a person like Sir Richard Colt Hall would normally associate with, especially to walk around the countryside with this person. But their passion together was sufficient for them to get over this class divide, and they became excellent colleagues, and one could argue very good friends as a result. The only thing that was missing now was someone to actually do the spade work. And again, a local father and son team, the Parkers, they were the ones depicted here in the field actually doing the work. I don't know whether the two people observing are actually Colt Hall and Cunnington, but certainly these two men were extremely powerfully built, and I think that does emerge from the slide. They were also capable, perhaps with the help of a local blacksmith, of actually developing the sort of tools that were required for this new type of digging. Pick and shovel there is what you see, but they also developed tools that were more appropriate to some of the finer work they did. We're going to fast forward now about 50 years and look at the life of General Pitt Rivers. There he is in front of us. He had a classificatory mind par excellence, which he'd already applied to military science, and immediately employed it to good effect when he unexpectedly inherited the Rushmore estate, right in the middle of Cranborne Chase. By then, of course, the Napoleonic Wars were a distant memory, and Europe had entered a new era in the mid-19th century, the era of revolutions. Pitt Rivers was, like Colt Hall, affected by what was going on in Europe. And really, this is where his educational work comes into it. He was convinced that the masses needed education to convince them that slow evolutionary change was what was needed, not revolution. So he was using prehistory as an object lesson that actually things should happen nice and slowly. Mind you, as the owner of Rushmore Estate, you could say, well, he would say that, wouldn't he? Because that was a way that people like him could actually hold on to their estates. Anyway, this is the sort of work that Pitt Rivers was doing. It is scientific archaeology. This is the war barrow, or was the war barrow, because his sort of archaeology left nothing there for anybody else. Whereas Colt Hall and Cunnington were digging down into the top of barrows and seeing what sort of artifacts were there. This is total removal of the barrow in order to understand it more perfectly. So Pitt Rivers anyway would have argued, using, of course, his estate workers, particularly when they weren't that busy on the estate, to do the work. And there is no doubt that when we look at Pitt Rivers's plans and sections, we are in the era of scientific archaeology. Colt Hall wasn't capable of developing plans like this. This is up at Bockley Dyke. You can see that nothing has been omitted. Everything that he uncovered is there. And we would probably think that this, even today, would be a good set of plans. The same can be said of his section drawings, and indeed his drawing of artifacts that he found on his excavations. He even built models of particular sites, partly for education purposes, but partly also to understand the sites better. And so from this point of view, Pitt Rivers was indeed, though he might not have liked the term, revolutionary. Rather than rapidly review the main excavations on Cranborne Chase, and there were a whole lot of them, we'll examine just one of them, Winklebury, Iron Age Hill Fort, above Berwick St John, very much in the northwest corner of the Chase and Chalke Partnership area, the Landscape Partnership area. We'll look at what both Colt Hall and Pitt Rivers thought about this site, what they did to it, and then contrast it with our own contemporary evaluation of the richness of the site and its immediate landscape. So this is a plan by Crocker, Philip Crocker, who was Colt Hall's draftsman of Winklebury. We can see the main features. We're not using here the language of later draftsmen, the hatchers, but we can see at least what the site looked like. This is Pitt Rivers, as you would expect. Excellent plan of the main features of Winklebury and its immediate environs as well. The site was owned by one of Pitt Rivers' relations, so he had no trouble in obtaining permission to excavate there. He also seemed to very quickly claim intellectual ownership of the site, mainly by damning his predecessor with faint praise. And this is what Pitt Rivers wrote. I'm reading now from his excavation report. Opinions have been hazarded by several writers as to the date and object of this camp, but I'm not aware that any exploration of it has been attempted. Sir Richard Colt Hall, after describing the three entrances which I have mentioned, observes that it differs materially from any camp that he has seen. He says that it contains 12 acres and its circumference is 1,056 yards, which is about correct, 1,040 yards being the measurement taken by me along the crest of the rampart. He says the ramparts are 39 feet deep, but this is an exaggeration, as they nowhere approach that depth. His description is accompanied by a very rough plan. In fact, Colt Hall's draftsman had done a pretty good job on the site, considering it was early 19th century. Now, Pitt Rivers' military background dominated his interpretation of Winklebury, which today, when we look at it, it rather stretches the imagination, given that the most vulnerable approach, the south, seems least well defended. And if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you will see, and we're facing slightly uphill there, that was actually the weakest part of the so-called defences. It would have taken years, even decades, to build Winklebury, so it couldn't really be seen as a response to an immediate threat. So basically, Pitt Rivers was completely swayed by his military background. And we do find that kind of subjectivity quite evident in the work of early archaeologists, Stukely, for example. Now, I'm not saying that we're any less subjective today. I'm sure we are subjective today, but I think we're probably more prepared to recognize subjectivity and state it or compensate in some way for it. This is subjectivity par excellence. This is a drawing made while we were doing some work at Winklebury, the Foundations of Archaeology project, mainly geophysics. This sort of drawing, which is not scientific archaeological drawing, as far as Pitt Rivers is concerned, I don't think it would have any place for him at all. Here are some illustrations of artifacts that Pitt Rivers discovered at Winklebury, and you can see that even today they would be considered very good illustrations. They are better than photographs. They're the first stage of interpretation, in fact. But I want to move now to look at some of the areas in which perhaps Pitt Rivers was a little bit deficient. Now, he was keen, as we've seen, to educate the masses, but he wasn't really very keen, on the other hand, to learn from them or to listen to them. Now, even A-level archaeology students today are told when they're reviewing all the sources available to the archaeologists that oral history is certainly a type of source that should not be neglected. As far as Pitt Rivers was concerned, this was all really superstition is what local people would have been talking about. And to some extent, you can have a bit of sympathy with Pitt Rivers. After all, we are now in the era of Huxley and Darwin. They'd had enough trouble breaking through what I suppose we could call the 4000 BC barrier. Bishop Usher from Ulster had worked out that actually only 4,000 years was possible for the beginning of prehistory, because if you look at the Bible and the generations, etc., that and add it all up, that's what you come to. So you can understand that Pitt Rivers was a little bit skeptical of anything that wasn't scientific and rational and proved. But he may have missed things along the way, and here I'm reading again from his excavation report. Barrow 3, Winklebury Hill. These, by the way, are the barrows that are on the upper part of the site that haven't got anything directly to do with the hill fort. This was to the north of the last. It was surrounded by a ditch, and the contents had probably been destroyed during the insertion of a dead yew tree, locally called a scrag. I removed the tree during excavation, and afterwards I learned that the people of the neighbourhood attached some interest to it, and it has been replaced by Sir Thomas Grove. Now, Sir Thomas Grove was his relative. He seems to have been a bit more sensitive than Pitt Rivers to the fact that there were tales and superstitions to do with Winklebury, which today we wouldn't entirely dismiss out of hand. We would at least be interested in them. Right, now this isn't Pitt Rivers' plan of Winklebury. This is the 1888 first edition Ordnance Survey, I think, or it might be the 1904. But anyway, what it shows is that there is actually a feature which I'm going to argue we might be a little bit more interested in than Pitt Rivers was in his time today. We would be more interested in it. And that is that line that runs down the right-hand side of the slide from top to bottom. Now, Pitt Rivers set the site very well in its landscape, but what we have on the right there is a sunken path or hollow way which runs up onto the higher ground immediately east of the Winklebury ramparts, and we can tell how deep it was due to the hatches. Unfortunately, it runs into the top of the picture of me, so you can't see that so well. The hatches, by the way, I mentioned before, but I like to call them tadpoles. If you take it looking at the top of a bank, for example, that the heads of the tadpoles always point uphill. So the top of a bank is quite easy to differentiate from the bottom of a ditch. Now, the hollow way, of course, is quite easy to see there. And as you would expect with a hollow way, actually, it becomes less hollow as you get to the top. That's something that you can observe about hollow ways, is that the steeper the slope, the deeper they tend to be because of water running through them. And in fact, it's not as if pit rivers did completely miss this feature. And in fact, I will once again read out from his report, because he does actually mention it. On the east and west sides of the hill are two very deep gullies, occupied by roads running north and south, one on the east running to the lower Bridmore Valley, and the other occupied by the present road from Rushmore to the village of Berwick St John. So we're concerned with the one to the east. These gullies appear to have been formed in the course of years by rainwater running along the channels formed, in the first instance by mule or horse tracks, and gradually washing it down. They afford good examples of the great amount of denudation that is produced by running water in this way. That on the east is as much as 23 feet deep and 63 feet wide on the top. However, he doesn't really recognize this feature as playing an important part in the history of the landscape. That might well be because, of course, it was pretty banal in those days. These footpaths, sunken ways, they were still in everyday use. They were part of the working landscape. Now, perhaps it's a shame that today, when these footpaths, these sunken ways, are used entirely for leisure purposes. You can't get a tractor up that sunken way. Then we are able, paradoxically, to evaluate and to understand the deep history, deep in more than the literal sense, of these sunken ways. I've included this picture, this painting taken from the east, looking at Winklebury, mainly because I like it. It's by Howard Phipps. However, it is quite important also in that it does show where the hollow way, if you look up at the left-hand shoulder of Winklebury there, you can see where the hollow way goes up. And hollow ways actually today, because they're negative features, you can't see them that often. You can't see them very well at all. But you can see the fact that trees and bushes have grown in the steep sides of them, and right at the top sometimes. And so you can actually see a positive feature, in other words, a line of trees or bushes which hides a hollow way below. But the other reason for showing this painting is that I think we can take it as read that even though Pitt Rivers was purely interested in science, etc., I think both him and his predecessor, Colt Hoare, they were very much taken with the landscape. I'm not in any way saying that they weren't affected by it subjectively, as well as measuring and quantifying it objectively. And in fact, I think it was William Cunnington, who was a very sick man a lot of his life. I think his doctor said, "Ride out or die." So actually being out in the landscape was much more important than just appreciating it subjectively. It may have actually kept him alive, though medically that might be a bit difficult to establish today. So this is the cover of Macfarlane's book called Hollow Way, an example really of how we would want to look a bit more deeply, if you forgive the pun, into hollow ways. And here is how Macfarlane encapsulates them. Holloway, the Holloway, a sunken path, a deep and shady lane, a route that centuries of footfall, hoof hit, wheel roll, and rain run have harrowed into the land, a track worn down by the traffic of ages and the fretting of water. Now, that sort of historical imagination is something we do value more today. It's not something really that Pitt Rivers in his time was particularly interested in. And that's not to decry Pitt Rivers altogether. It's just to say that we we actually have slightly different preoccupations, which was how I mentioned the problem at the beginning of this talk. Now, it's not just writers such as Macfarlane who are interested in features such as hollowways. The Landscape Partnership, Chase and Chalke, evolved a statement of significance, and here's the first page as a slide, in which people were invited to comment on places they felt to be special. Now, it may actually say somewhere in the text, but even if it doesn't, it is important, I think, to stress that the European Landscape Convention boils down its whole philosophy into one sentence, which is a landscape is as perceived by people. And of course, that applies to historic landscape as well. So it's highly appropriate that we should know what people feel about particular parts of the landscape. And there are several mentions of hollowways or sunken lanes in this report. And I'm just going to quote one of them. First of all, the place is described. This is an ancient field system and sunken track on South Down, just west of East Combe Wood. I rather like that. On South Down, just west of East Combe Wood. Quite a lot of orientation there in those names. And why is it special? It's special to this person. It's special to me because I can sit there facing north, painting the landscape and watching the birds fly over in great flocks and thinking how ancient the track must be as it is so deep. Now, we don't have to confine ourselves to subjectivist appreciation of hollow lanes or sunken tracks. We can actually look at them scientifically. There are measurable variables involved. The slope, an estimation of the time they were used, the amount of traffic that used them, the geology that they broke through, and I suppose even more important than that, where did they go? What places did they link up, and what were the uses? Now, in fact, in 2010, Emma Rouse prepared a historic routeways characterization plan, and she selected, interestingly, for her pilot study, pretty well the same area as the area selected for the Chalke and Chase Landscape Partnership project. As you can see from the slide, there's a lot going on there in terms of historic routeways. Now, these historic routeways, of course, are rather more than sunken lanes or hollow ways. There are other types of routeway as well. And perhaps a final word about hollow lanes, sunken ways. In the study area, you can see them best on the western side of the study area. So that's off at right angles to the A350 between Shaftesbury and Blandford. You can see them heading up onto the Chalke, and similarly you can see them on the northern side of the study area, where they're heading south up from that direction up onto the Chalke. Interestingly, they're somewhat cutting against the grain of the landscape and the river valleys, which are east to west. There's even one or two which you can see in the south between Whitsbury and Martin. But anyway, to come back to the point there, these routeways are not just sunken lanes, and they're not just hollow ways. They are all over the Chase, and if we look at this particular slide, which is historic character of routeways AD 1700 to 1900, we can see that in this particular frozen time frame, we have quite a lot of different types of routeway. So, for example, We've got ornamental drives. It does not exist, so by that stage, it was something that had gone out of use. It was a routeway that had gone out of use. Droveways, enclosure roads, etc. Now, it's not really appropriate to go into a great deal of detail here about Emma Rous's characterization. Suffice it to say that this is something that perhaps was understudied by archaeologists in the past. And if we look at the way that archaeology is funded today, often by public bodies, and often involves volunteers in the community, we can say that we can perhaps safely say that the projects of the future, they have to involve people, and gone are the days of just opening, like Pitt Rivers did, enormous areas of excavation in order to tease out one or two problems to do with a hillfort. Of course, we can still do things like geophysics today, but it's more likely that we will see projects that involve people's own perceptions of the landscape and their appreciation of it in terms of the sort of archaeology that we will see developed, particularly in projects like the current one, where the community is at the heart of the matter. So I hope I've managed to make some sense, really, of the idea that that different periods have different archaeologies, and we're not really saying one is better than the other. We're saying that each serves its age perhaps better than the other. So thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you to Phil Planel for presenting this talk as part of the Spring Talk series, hosted by the Chase Chalke Landscape Partnership scheme. Thank you to our partners and funders for this talk. The Chase Chalke Landscape Partnership is a group of organisations working together to protect and enhance the special landscape of Cranborne Chase and the Chalke Valley. With Cranborne Chase AONB as the lead partner, and with support from the National Lottery Heritage Fund, this 5-year partnership is working with local communities to better connect people with the landscape. For more information, please visit www.cranbornechase.org.uk.